I spoke to a client of mine recently and he asked me about this idea of buying an overseas property. We'll address that towards the end of this video. And the main reason he was thinking of that is because he was really concerned about the high cost of living in Singapore. Today, maybe you are also thinking the same things. Maybe you have the same fears. And high cost of living comes from many angles. First, high home prices, correct? That directly translates to more loans that take longer years to pay off. Then next, high car prices. Myself, I need to renew COE in 2 years' time. Currently, COE is $100,000. Then last but not least, something that affects everybody, high GST costs of 9%. Now, when you go to eat at a restaurant, you realize 10% service charge and 9% GST, which is 19% on top of everything you order. And that's why high cost of living is always such a thorny subject that's been used many a times in our recent election rallies.
What is worse, the government has only added fuel to the flame of rising costs. They insisted on raising GST in 2023.
No PAP candidate wanted to substantively engage the issue of why GST had to be hiked during a global inflation storm and why it could not be delayed.
Now to that point, is there solutions that government can do? What has been proposed? Cut back on GST, changing how water bills and electricity bills are being charged. And something else proposed, which is free healthcare. To that point, I don't know if you know or not, but as of 1st of April, MediShield Life premiums have gone up. Of course, the headline will read that it provides a bit more, higher premium, higher claim limits, higher number of days that you can claim for, etc, etc. But when we see that the jump across is 20%, something like that, from the previous to the current rates, we all are naturally concerned. Let's look at some numbers. If you have a young kid, previously it was $148. Moving forward, it'll be $200 just for MediShield Life. Of course, this phasing in will take a couple of years, and there'll be subsidies to defray it all the way until 2027. And if you're older in retirement, say at 61, you realize that from $1,039, you jump 10% to $1,131. Then again, there's a difference between low income to high income. But all in all, there's still extra cost that's deducting from your MediSave. So back to the point of all these ideas on where government can help reduce high cost of living. Personally, for myself, I'm pretty sure that they've weighed the pros and cons. If we increase GST, what will happen? I think that perhaps high cost of living will only come down when there is deflation. Something we've seen in Japan. But the question becomes, is deflation problematic or not? We've been so used to seeing gradual inflation, correct? That's what most of the monetary system is built on. But when it comes to deflation, you realize that economies shrink, people get poorer. Which means also, Japanese 30 years ago felt a lot wealthier than Japanese today in general. And to elaborate on Japan, I recently saw a video on a Singaporean family moving to Japan, and personally for myself, I have also a friend with a Japanese wife and he's residing there right now. Actually, non-Tokyo central houses in Japan are not that expensive. That's because of the years and years of deflation effect. And back to my friend who also has young kids. When I quizzed him about it, he was concerned that Japanese economy is shrinking, it's aging. He doesn't know for sure what are the opportunities there are for his children. That's why he's always keeping the door open to come back to Singapore or maybe even branching out to the US side. And as we do know, Japanese yen has tumbled massively over the last few years, correct? Indirectly, that puts people living in Japan in a poorer state relative to the rest of the world. At least for Singapore, with high cost of living, our Sing dollar is still pretty strong. So back to the topic about high cost of living. Government has in this election given us vouchers, which is their usual playbook, and Mr. James Lim has put it very well.
To have no better ideas on how to address these problems other than more handouts and more vouchers. High cost of living aren't just because the world at large has experienced post-pandemic inflation. High cost of living in Singapore are as much a homemade structural problem, demanding structural solutions.
And the problem of it, Mr. James Lim has put it very well. More handouts, more vouchers, more $300 that you and we can use, but we can guess. $300 would mean a lot to the lower income segment of our Singaporean society. But from the middle income onwards, $300 doesn't defray that much of a cost. That's because our housing loans are in few hundred thousand or in millions, correct? And that is likely the biggest reason why Singaporeans want to retire early but lack the confidence, correct? And yes, I do know also that government has a lot of grants, for HDB purchases. So it's also true that there's things done. My conclusion is that higher property prices are okay, and they'll perhaps use grants to fill up the gap rather than get property prices to come down drastically. At least that keeps the wealth effect for everybody, and at least the lower income segments of our society can still get help. I've also seen before a report on lower income. It is estimated that 12% of households do not earn enough income for basic needs. And that's not the worst. There is a term called relative poverty, which is what we all feel when we think high cost of living, correct? Estimated of 26% of households in Singapore do not earn enough to keep up with the rest of Singapore. Keep up with the rest. And I do know that in every equation of average, there'll be some who are above average and some who are below average that cannot keep up. So it's just a natural statistic. But I think this is more telling. This 26% is higher than any other advanced economy. And if we see across developed countries like USA, Japan, UK, Australia, this relative poverty rate is lower. Does that mean that more people there do not feel the high cost of living as much as Singaporeans? Interesting question. And that also leads to the next part of why does it feel that high cost of living is so bad in Singapore? Is it because there is so much money stuck in CPF? The CPF monthly income ceiling is going up to $8,000 next year, and the CPF full lump sum for next year is $220,400, a 7,000+ increment from this year. Every year for CPF full lump sum, it will also increase, like what I've shared many times on the channel. So CPF does lock up quite a bit of money, but there's also a benefit whereby it takes care of the long-term retirement. But the short-term pain, of course, is still felt. Then the next part is it because there's too much stuck in property? Singapore properties are very resilient. We see right now that there's record prices all the time. But just now I've addressed, property price increment creates a wealth effect. Hoping that it comes down may not be a good idea. And many Singaporean families, when they upgrade, they realize that the property has brought their first pot of gold to them. So how? What to do about high cost of living? Emigrate abroad? According to some findings in 2019, there's 90,000+ of Singaporeans residing in Malaysia, about 25%. That's expected because Malaysia is very near, correct? And I would guess that the bulk of Singaporeans living there are in Johor. Malaysia is cheaper in cost of living versus Singapore, but the curious part is there's still a lot of people residing in Australia, UK, and US. Places over here are not that cheap, correct? So maybe it's for studies and stuff like that or work opportunities. And rounding up the top 8 list, there is Hong Kong, which is possibly even more expensive than Singapore. So on this top 8 list, Japan is not there. I think that could be climbing up the ladder. And also very surprising is Thailand is not there. I do have friends with a Thai wife, and even this client of mine, he thought about Thailand because he goes there for work very often. He feels familiar with it, and he's been recently seeing some showrooms over there, getting very excited about the price and the proposition of living a big house over there. So he thought about the house, and that's why at the start of this video, I shared the story of us discussing about overseas property. I always feel that overseas property, it feels very shiok before you buy. And once you buy it, you realize that there is headache. How to find tenant, the tenant yield is so low. In Malaysia, I think it's like 1% or less even for many properties, which means a landed property can be like 1 million ringgit, but the rent you can fetch is only 1,500. Then how to maintain it, or how to convince your other half to live there happily if you want to use it as a retirement home. Owning something in Malaysia, Thailand, Australia seems nice until you really own it. Then all the headache and regret starts to come in. And this was shared in a forum. I bought a house in London where I live and work there. I kept it. Quite tempted to sell it because filing taxes, managing a property is a bit of a pain. I follow stories also. Buy Malaysia property, 800,000 ringgit last time, 10 years ago. Now, still 800,000. And along this 10 years, ringgit has depreciated so much against Sing dollar, correct? This other forumer also mentioned, I've invested in London and Melbourne properties. Held it for 4 or 5 years and they all appreciated, but not much against Sing dollar. Better off investing in Singapore properties and renting out and using rental income to rent a retirement home overseas. And all this while, there's ringgit loan, for example, that costs 5-6% easily. Actually, most overseas properties are around that rates. Australia also 5-6-7%. Leave in the comment sections what your own experience is if you have bought something overseas before, and what are your thoughts so far on high cost of living in Singapore. As always, smash on the like button. And my conclusions are that Yes, Singapore cost of living is high, but there are good parts also. The income level is higher here relative to, for example, Malaysia and neighboring countries. The Sing dollar is also very strong. The property value will also likely preserve very well and possibly appreciate also. So the first thing I'll suggest is, if you want to live abroad, probably rent. That's why I suggested to the client of mine also. And to keep your CPF intact, which means you can ride one of the most reliable retirement cash flow machines. Do you know that if you give up your Singaporean citizenship, your CPF account will close? The money will be returned back to a bank account. Many who have emigrated overseas have continued to keep their Singapore citizenship. Maybe you may have a different point of view, same as Mr. Lu, who I've interviewed in this previous video when he bought his Malaysian landed property. Check that video on Georgetown Live, and hopefully there's further nuggets of wisdom to help you in your financial journey. With that, sign off from me and see you there. Take care as always. Goodbye.